I think let's get started. People will trickle in as they are able to. My name is Allison Rodacker. I work for the ACRCD. I am here today just to keep people on time. We know time is very important. And we're going to start today. First, we're going to use the chat for questions. So if you have a question for one of our presenters, go ahead and put it in the chat, which is down below. And Stephanie will work on moderating that when the time comes. Please go ahead and take a minute, like Stephanie said, and mute yourselves. And I think that's it. I'm going to introduce my coworker, Ian Howell, and he's going to take it from here.
Good afternoon, everyone. So glad you're here. Can y'all hear me okay? Heads nodding. Perfect. All right. Well, you're in the right place. Thanks so much for being part of this workshop, Spreading Compost on Rangelands. As Allison said, my name is Ian Howell. I'm a program manager with the Alameda County Resource Conservation District, where I coordinate our carbon farming program. And I'm really excited by the turnout today. I see the numbers shooting up here. And I know from looking at the registration information, we've got a really diverse audience. You all represent various perspectives in professions, from farmers and ranchers, planners, researchers, agricultural organizations, educators, extension and resource agency staff, local government officials, and land managers. So before we get going into the content of our 2-hour workshop this afternoon, I need to say just a few words about the Alameda County Resource Conservation District. We are a special district whose mission is to provide leadership in natural resources conservation, wildlife and habitat preservation, and agricultural enhancements through partnerships, education, outreach, resource services, and technical expertise. So let's get on to the fun stuff. Why are we talking about carbon farming and compost today? Well, as you'll hear through a variety of presentations this afternoon, carbon farming practices are a climate change solution that can be implemented on working landscapes. They can be beneficial to agricultural operations, and there are also benefits to soil, water, and habitat. And the RCD, from our perspective, we set out several years ago now to really think about and evaluate the feasibility of implementing compost projects for carbon farming in Alameda County. And there were some big questions on our minds that we're still working to answer. And as you'll see, we're going to share how our thinking is evolving on this. For example, will compost be effective for ranchers to implement on their ground? Will we see measurable change in soils and vegetation? And can we do this without adversely affecting wildlife? So as we work through the afternoon, if you'd like to learn more, if you're interested, please know that there are funding and technical assistance programs available. And we're happy to help you connect with those programs. For example, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service offers technical assistance, as well as their EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which is a funding program to farmers and ranchers. At the state level, there's the California Department of Food and Agriculture's Healthy Soils Program, both its demonstration grants as well as its incentives contracts directly with farmers and ranchers. And in some cases, the Alameda County RCD may be able to work with you through our grant funding to provide technical assistance and support. Okay. So let's talk about the agenda for just a minute, and then we'll really dive in earnest here. In preparing this workshop series, and this is the first in a series of workshops that we have planned for the next year plus, we thought it'd be really helpful to look beyond carbon farm planning, which for RCD folks, many of us have been thinking about this for a long time. I myself have been to several workshops on carbon farm planning. It's always great stuff, but what's the next step? What about planning and executing the projects that are advised in a carbon farm plan? And so we wanted to share our experiences looking at compost prices and suppliers, examining compost quality as we've had to do before spreading it, and think about the details of compost implementation projects with our partners. And so to that end, our agenda today. We'll start with Jeff Creque, describing soil, carbon, water, and climate, the carbon cycle as an organizing principle in agriculture. We'll then have a discussion about a carbon farming partnership between the Alameda County Resource Conservation District and numerous partners, including StopWaste, as well as our Healthy Soils Demonstration Grant. And then we'll take a break for questions and answers at the bottom of the first hour. In the second hour, we'll dig deeper into compost for carbon farming. And then we'll hear from Calhoun Ranch, their experiences with carbon farming and compost projects. And in particular, one detail there is their use of the Healthy Soils Program incentives through the California Department of Food and Ag. We'll then have another round of Q&A. And before we wrap up, we'll review some funding resources. And if we end on time, we'll make sure to leave you with a link to a post-workshop evaluation where you can really help us see how we did today, whether the information was useful to you. And we'll, like I said, if we end on time, we'll actually be ending a couple minutes early to set you up with that evaluation before 5 o'clock. All right, and so with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and introduce Jeff Creque. Jeff joins us from the Carbon Cycle Institute. He's a rangeland ecologist and a founding member of the Marin Carbon Project. I've always been impressed by Jeff's ability to speak to both planners as well as carbon farmers. And so with that, Jeff is going to get us started off on the right foot today. Jeff, looks like you're on mute.
How's that? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I just noticed I hadn't changed the date or the location of this talk. I spoke to folks at Cal Poly yesterday on a very similar subject, so my apologies for that. The process by which I came to perceive the carbon cycle as an organizing principle, a key organizing principle in understanding my own land stewardship activities was really intimately tied to the work of the Marine Carbon Project and Dr. Becca Riles, who's joined us today, I'm really pleased to see. And so I'm gonna just share some of that learning that's gone on through for me over the last decade or so. You know, it all kind of starts with this, the fact that we're facing a really catastrophic change in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere associated with human activities on the planet. And this very precipitous rise in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. From the perspective of agriculture and the position of agriculture within the larger carbon cycle on the planet, this rise in CO2 is I think, of particular import. And while, as a previous slide noted, we're at about 415 parts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today, when we include other greenhouse gases such as nitrous oxide and methane, which are also associated with agriculture, we're really sitting at about 500 parts per million. So we're facing a much more serious situation than generally is even acknowledged by those of us who've been warning of this problem for quite some time. It's very interesting to note the role of soil carbon in this rise in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Sanderman and others published this a couple of years ago, in which they looked at the contribution that soil carbon had made to rising CO2 levels. And what you basically see here in the blue is a steady rise in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, starting around the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, of course, and the combustion of coal, and then subsequently other fossil fuels, and really ramping up after the Second World War as we industrialized globally, including the industrialization of our agriculture. And so as we burned fossil fuels at an increasing rate, we were also increasing our capacity to manage or disturb our ecosystems and consequently our soils, and causing an acceleration in the loss of carbon from our cropland and our grazing land soils. And that's what you see in the little inset there. So overall, we've seen about 27% of the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today is coming from our working landscapes due to the clearing of forests, draining of wetlands, and of course, conversion of forests and grasslands to agricultural production. It's important, I think, that we understand that agriculture is probably more vulnerable to climate change than any other sector of human activity. If we thought that predicting the weather was difficult 50 or 100 years ago, I think we all know that it's become even more so now. And the implications of not knowing when the first frost is going to come, when the last frost is going to come, whether we're going to have a frost, when the rains are going to come, what form the rains are going to come in, all of that is radically disturbing what have been long established patterns of predictable patterns of weather, upon which our agricultural planning efforts really depend. We also, and this climate change is essentially irreversible. Unless we were in some way able to remove a large quantity of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And as we survey the situation today, we only have one strategy that is truly viable for achieving that reduction of atmospheric CO2, and that is to enhance our soil carbon at the expense of atmospheric carbon. That is, I think, well illustrated by this, these graphics out of a paper by Hansen and others. On the left, you see the potential to reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide through emission reductions alone. Our current trajectory, of course, is taking us basically into the stratosphere as far as carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. But if we could reduce our emissions by, say, 3% or even 6%, we could hope to hold atmospheric CO2 about where it is by the end of the century. Now, last year I would have said a 6% decline in emissions would have been impossible, but we actually saw about a 7% decline in carbon dioxide emissions with the onset of COVID. That has since disappeared, but it actually enjoyed that very briefly at the beginning of the pandemic. The graph on the right shows what we could achieve if we begin to draw down CO2, begin to extract CO2 from the atmosphere, and reduce our emissions. In that case, this model predicts we could get back to about 350 parts per million by the end of the century. And some folks think that would be a safe level. We could probably argue about that all day, but it certainly is a more hopeful scenario than a emission reductions only scenario. Fundamentally, the point I really want to make here is how key carbon is to both agricultural production and to the resilience of our agricultural systems in the face of climate change. And that is well illustrated, I think, in this image from Rikoski from the Ag Research Service. What is soil? That term is being widely bandied about. I think we recognize that a soil is healthy. Whether or not soil is healthy really depends on the purpose to which we intend to put that soil, the use to which we plan to put that soil. But I think we can generally agree that a healthy soil is well aggregated, it's biologically active, and it's carbon rich. And I think although Leopold really kind of put his finger on it when he said that soil fertility is the ability of soil to receive, store, and release energy. And what energy are we talking about? We're talking about solar energy, right? So how does solar energy end up in the soil system? So from NRCS, I think does a nice job of showing how the sun provides the energy of photosynthesis, by which plants then draw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and produce their own biomass and support soil biology and all the food to the growing plant, to the soil, and to all of the diverse biological systems that are supported by the sun ultimately through the process, that photosynthetic process. Which really brought us to this whole concept of carbon farming and carbon farm planning. If we could begin to manage our agricultural systems for optimum carbon capture, we could begin to imagine moving agriculture towards this climate beneficial goal. And that's really what carbon farm planning is all about. And essentially what we're doing is taking a whole farm conservation approach, taking a page straight out of the NRCS handbook, but putting the carbon cycle at the center of the conservation planning process, recognizing all the co-benefits of increasing on-farm carbon, both in production increases, soil health increases, improvements in water quantity and water quality. This work has been greatly facilitated by recent work by the USDA, quantifying the carbon implications or the greenhouse benefits or costs of a variety of on-farm practices. And this is the USDA Blue Book, first published in 2014. It's currently under revision and probably will be released as a revised version this year. This underlies the Comet Planner model, which we use within our planning process to quantify the greenhouse gas benefits of a whole suite of conservation practices applied in an agricultural context. Now, where we have good local data, we tend to prefer to use that, such as the good compost data we have from Dr. Ryle's work, or David Lewis's work out of Marin County with riparian restoration. But where we lack local data, we can rely on these tools, these online tools, simple, easy to use online tools that are being constantly updated and improved by the Comet team at Colorado State University. Now, as probably most of you know, the state of California, a few years back now, identified carbon sequestration in the land base as one of the state's primary climate response strategies. And at that time, set a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. More recently, in fact, just before Jerry Brown left office, he set a state goal of carbon neutrality by 2045. Agriculture in California currently emits about 36 million metric tons of carbon dioxide annually. So if we're going to be carbon neutral, we would want to be sequestering about 36 million metric tons of CO2 every year. In 2019, the Air Resources Board and the agencies shown here released the draft National Working Lands Climate Change Implementation Plan, proposing achieving sequestration of 10 to 15 million metric tons by 2030, about an order of magnitude too low for agriculture to be carbon neutral. And there was a lot of pushback on that goal. It was too weak, and ARB is currently, this draft is now in revision, and I think we'll probably see a new draft out as early as March. Hopefully recognizing the potential for ag as a climate solution. Compost, and I'm sure we'll get more into this later today, but compost is a particularly effective carbon farming strategy for a whole bunch of reasons. Most importantly, I think the compost process actually conserves carbon. So if we took compost feedstocks and we spread them out over the landscape, most of the carbon embodied in that material would very quickly end up back in the atmosphere. But the properties of the compost ecosystem, if you will, are such that carbon and other nutrients are retained within the compost environment. They're basically recycled as the material decomposes. Now, there is an enormous amount of carbon lost through the composting process. About 50% of that carbon ends up outgassing from the compost pile as CO2, but there's about 50% of it is conserved, which is comparable really to biochar, if you think about it. So compost is really a very conservative strategy for handling on-farm organic materials, or any organic materials, including municipal waste, sewage sludge, and all those things. There are a whole bunch of different ways to quantify the benefits of compost application and use and production, and the numbers are kind of all over the map. It's really a question of, what's your question? What are you looking at? Comet Planner, it's very, very conservative in its quantification. It assumes the producer will continue to use synthetic nitrogen, and consequently emissions associated with that synthetic nitrogen are included in the model. The potential to avoid that nitrogen use is not included, except up to 20% of that synthetic nitrogen use. So I think Comet Planner severely underestimates the benefits of compost use. ARB has a more generous model, making a whole different suite of assumptions, and the numbers you see on the right are from ARB's analysis, showing greenhouse gas benefits associated on a per acre basis with the application of compost at the rates that CDFA has been recommending. And we could get into a very long conversation about those recommended rates, and hopefully we will later in this presentation. This is some very early data. I just thought I'd throw it out as an example. This is from Marcy DeLonge's work, again, out of the Silver Lab back in 2013, comparing the greenhouse gas emissions from 3 different materials: compost, manure, and inorganic synthetic fertilizers. And as you can see here, compost falls well below the 0 line. In other words, is a very strong net sequester of carbon, or avoidance, a good strategy for avoidance of greenhouse gas emissions. And if applied to about 5% of California's grasslands, would sequester roughly somewhere around 30 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent with that initial application. And 5% of California grasslands, I think, is a pretty good estimate of the amount of California grasslands that would in fact be suitable for receiving compost applications. So all of this adds up, in my opinion, and the opinion of others, that we do have the potential to counteract our unintentional anthropogenic forcing of atmospheric carbon with an intentional forcing of soil organic carbon, and that we would need to do this obviously at the global scale to be truly effective. But we can certainly start here in California, where we have the resources and the knowledge to begin to enact this work at scale. Importantly, there's a water signature associated with increasing soil organic carbon. This is a very simple model that NRCS put forward some years ago, suggesting that for every 1% increase in soil organic matter, we increase soil water holding capacity by about 1 acre inch. This is 25,000 gallons. 1 acre inch is about 26,000 gallons. So simple, easy to remember relationship between soil organic matter and water holding capacity. Graphic example, this happens to be from Australia, but here you have a fence line. The soils on either side of this fence are exactly the same in origin, and yet you can see the hydrological differences associated with managing for carbon on the left, and of course ignoring soil carbon on the right. And the implications for California, I think, are pretty obvious. This is some work done by Alan Flint and Lori Flint out of USGS back in 2018 under the auspices of the Forest Climate Assessment for the state of California, looking at the implications of increasing soil organic matter across the 44 million acre working lands of the state, looking at a 1%, a 2%, and a 3% soil organic matter increase. And you can see At the top, you see an increase in soil moisture storage associated with an organic matter increase. Not too surprising. An increase in actual evapotranspiration, which is used in this case as kind of a surrogate for plant productivity. So plant productivity increases with that increase in soil organic matter. And then ultimately an increase in groundwater recharge. Now on the bottom of this, these are counties, California counties on the bottom. So this variation that you see in the benefits of all these various parameters are clearly associated with the different soil types and perhaps climatic regimes of these different California counties. But the net effect is about a 6 million acre foot increase in hydrologic benefit across the state. And the value of that, I think, can be compared to the state's willingness to spend over $1 billion to increase Shasta Reservoir storage by 1/10 of that amount. So again, we have largely ignored this pivotal role that soil carbon plays in the hydrologic dynamics of our soils and our watersheds.
Jeff, we have 3 minutes.
And I'm about done.
Great.
This work, to do this work, we need partners like the RCDs, and particularly the RCDs, to do the work on the ground. We're currently working with the counties you see shown here, and ideally, this work will be launched across the entire United States over the next couple of years, or some semblance of this type of work. In California, we've got about 100 carbon farm plans written in aggregate with the potential to sequester about 1.5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide over 20 years. And a number of other plans are in development and proposed in the very near future. So just closing, I think, the real good news is we can safely, effectively, and beneficially store our surplus atmospheric carbon dioxide in our soils, use that carbon to produce food, fuel, fiber, and ultimately soil fertility. And hopefully we will begin to see some economic benefits coming to agriculture as a direct result of this pivotal role that agriculture has to play in the climate equation. So I will stop there and turn this back over. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Jeff. If everyone wants to quickly unmute and give him a round of applause. Thank you so much. And like we said, we will do questions for Jeff after our next round of speakers. So to keep things moving, I want to introduce Kelly Schoonmaker. She is the program manager for StopWaste, where she manages compost and mulch programs and serves as the property manager for StopWaste's Altamont property. Kelly?
Great, thanks, Allison. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar with StopWaste, we're the Alameda County Waste Management Authority. We are a government agency, and our mission is to keep stuff out of landfill. And we do that through a variety of programs, education and outreach, grants, technical assistance, and a couple ordinances that we enforce. We also obviously own some property in the Altamont Hills. It's about 1,600 acres. I'll show you a little bit more detail of it. We had originally purchased the property for additional landfill capacity in the 1990s. But it turns, we're not using it for that. We probably won't ever need to. So now what we want to do with this property is be able to be a model for other public landowners and do things like a carbon farm plan and a carbon farm project with our partners, the RCD. So this little photo here, you can see a little tour from far away. This is kind of right, I don't know if this is right after we met, but we met almost 4 years ago to the day, where we wanted to do carbon farming at StopWaste, and we didn't know how to get started. And so we reached out to some folks at the Carbon Cycle Institute and the Marine Carbon Project, and they said, oh, you need to talk to your RCD. And so we did. That's how we met Ian, and eventually Stephanie and Allison and Ling at NRCS and everyone. And the meeting was great. Joe, who's also on this workshop today, was there. He's our rancher. And it was a great meeting. We were very excited, and we kind of came into it not knowing how to do a carbon farm plan. And then I remember at one point Ian saying, we know how to do carbon farm plans because they're very similar to what we already do, but we just don't know that much about compost. And so we were like, aha, we can help you with that. So that's how I got started. So let's see a little bit about the property. It's in the eastern eastern border of Alameda County, right off 580. And for those of you sort of in the neighborhood, it's off, the bulk of it is off of North Flynn Road. Next slide. And there's many uses on the property. Most visibly and notably, we've got grazing, which of course, and we also have a wind operation. In 2015, there was a repowering of the wind and went from 400 of those of the tiny windmills, over 400, to about 20 of the gigantic windmills. And anyway, the whole place turned into a construction site. And so what that means is we've got some highly disturbed and compacted soils all over the place. So it's not the most pristine environment, and it's also not like a mess of a construction site. It's just that I'm just trying to illustrate that it's not like this sort of pristine, untouched place. The other thing though about the construction and the windmills is it gives us access, which is important because it's a really hilly property, and of course what's next slide. And you can kind of see that here, some of the hills in the background. In the foreground, you can see Ian and Hillary Sardinius, who was at the RCD at the time, working with Joe Paulo, our rancher, to identify some good locations, to kind of finalize the locations for compost application for the project that Ian is about to discuss. Go ahead, Ian.
Thanks. So let me start first by talking a little bit about our carbon farm plan work with the StopWaste property. We wanted to really treat this as a carbon farm plan should be, which is holistically and considering not just the opportunities for soil enhancement and carbon sequestration, but looking at all the needs for managing the property well. And so one thing we heard loud and clear from Joe Paulo is the need to really focus on stock water and aquatic habitat. And so we've tried to do that. And in close coordination with our colleagues at the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. And so, the goal that we heard from Joe was, let's get the cattle to graze where they don't normally go. And to do that, we need to facilitate the management with additional fencing and stock water projects. We're also looking at riparian areas. There are enhancement opportunities. And of course, one of the things that's a real strength of Alameda County RCD and our partners in the Livermore NRCS office is wildlife biology. And so we've thought a lot about how the carbon farm plan and any actions we recommend in it are give proper consideration to common and sensitive wildlife. Okay, so one other key area in our carbon farm plan, and just question that we want to know something about in general, is the effectiveness of compost to enhance soils and vegetation on the site. And so we started implementing the compost portion of our carbon farm plan even as we've been writing it. We've done that through a California Department of Food and Agriculture Healthy Soils Program demonstration grant. So that's different than the incentives contracts that CDFA has also through the Healthy Soils Program, and we'll talk about that as well later. But this demonstration grant was awarded to the RCD in 2019. It's $250,000 that's allowing us to test a research question and provide information in workshops like this one. So what's that looking like? Well, we established 5 pairs of test and control plots like these in the image here. So on the test plot, we're putting compost on the control, no compost. These plots are about 1 acre each, and they are paired on steeper slopes of about 15 to 30%, because that is the ultimate question that we are trying to answer. How does compost affect soils and vegetation on those steep rangeland slopes? And as Kelly pointed out, there's a great road system here that gives us access to this very, very hilly site that would otherwise be challenging to get equipment into. Okay, so let me take a second to talk about CDFA's Healthy Soils Demonstration Program. Exactly what is this? Sorry, talked about that already in the last slide. Again, it's a research question. So this is an applied field study, and of course the outreach to go with it. I have to give credit to my former colleague Hillary for writing the bulk of the proposal for this grant and really working on the study design, which is what you can see here. This is sort of the imagined study design of those paired plots, the control and treatment, and a whole variety of sampling to be done on both. And we knew we needed a really strong scientific partner to execute this kind of a plan and really to help finish formulating what this would look like, the actual study design. And so Hillary just said, well, I'll get in touch with Rebecca Riles and see if she's interested. And Rebecca Riles said, yeah, very interested. And so that was the start of what has become a really great partnership with Rebecca Riles' Agroecology Lab at the University of California, Merced. All right, so let's talk a little bit about logistics and getting ready to get compost on the site. We talked about roads already, great access. Before even thinking about getting material to the site, we had to figure out where these study plots were going to be. And so we did a lot of field planning to look at the slopes and consider where are these moderately steep slopes, because there's plenty that's outside of that 30% band. But where are these areas where there's actually a lot of real estate to put two of these plots side by side? And we spent a number of days out in the field. Joe Paulo was really instrumental in helping us become familiar with different areas of the property, and also his knowledge of things like access and gates throughout the year, because once the rainy season comes, roads that aren't improved turn to mud. All these are really good considerations for what you see here is a field meeting with compost vendors and spreading contractors to get their feedback, share information about how this is going to run, and ultimately get realistic cost estimates. So before compost went on, we spent a good amount of time preparing the site. Mostly that looked like a lot of flagging the boundaries of the study plots, but also additional areas, because we're going to put on more compost than just the 5 test plots, which is about 5 acres. And so you can see a lot of that flagging happening on the left. In particular, we're looking at ground squirrel burrows. Because those burrows provide habitat to other critters that we care about, we wanted to make sure that the compost wasn't deliberately or inadvertently directed right into those things. We also had a species training with the compost spreading crew, and you can see that happening on the right. The name of the game here is avoidance. If we can avoid any kind of sensitive habitat, that's what we wanted to do. Some other considerations, we avoided rocky outcrop areas in our plots to the greatest extent possible, which was hard here. We avoided big burrow colonies. Pretty challenging to find areas totally clear of those burrows, but avoidance. All right, so here you can see the compost going on, and it's obviously happening with blower trucks, not a mechanical spreader. I want to talk about why. This all came down to timing. We wanted to wait until December for some rain and for the winds to die down a little bit, because November of 2019 was mostly very hot and very windy. And so we're like, okay, well, December's our month. Now on the other side of that, the Healthy Soils Demonstration Grant stipulated that we get the compost on by December 31st. And so we really only gave ourselves a month's window. As it turned out, we had a lot of rain from November 27th until December 15th. That's 2.5 weeks. We had 16 rainy days, and the precipitation was about 2.3 inches. There's actually a weather station up on the property, so we've got really good data for weather up there. And there just wasn't a lot of sunshine or time for dry out in between bigger rain events. We'd get a little spritz, it'd be cloudy. And the soils were just too soft to run heavy tractor pulled equipment on without disturbing the very soils and vegetation that we wanted to study. So we had to switch to our contingency plan and bring in this more expensive blown on compost operation. Okay, so outcomes. We ultimately spread compost on 12.5 acres. You can see here in the image with the map with the white and red squares. These are the study and control plots. So red ones got compost, the white ones didn't. And then we had all those pink areas, which were extra compost placement areas, because we wanted to do more than just 5 acres, but 5 key acres as part of that replicated study design. Let's see. Ultimately, we used 420 cubic yards of material that got spread out at about a 1/4 inch application rate. And if we look at the work that people like Rebecca Riles have done on the sequestration rate, we can game that out over 20 years of sequestration. 1.49 metric tons per year over 12.5 acres times 20 years gets us up to about 372 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, CO2e, sequestered in the soils. And that came at a cost. It was expensive. This is not the poster child of an inexpensive project. $27,000 just in direct costs. So that's none of the staff time from Joe, from Kelly, from myself, and other staff who were involved, and there were many of us. But that's kind of the point of having the Healthy Soils Demonstration Grant, is to utilize those grant funds to do this project, observe the process, observe the outcomes of the study, and hopefully make good recommendations to all of you joining us today. So before the compost went on, and in the time since then, we've been sampling a lot. We've been sampling soils down to 1 meter depth to observe the carbon content in those soils. We've also been looking at infiltration, so the rate that water can be absorbed into the soils. We're looking at compaction, how packed together that soil is. And we're also looking at a couple of different measures of vegetation. So in the top left here, you can see we're measuring the vegetation composition. How does that plant community change or not change over time in both the composted and non-composted sites? And we're also looking at the productivity. Is there an increase in the vegetation growth in the compost versus control sites? And so you can see this exclosure cage being assembled so that we can measure that effect without the presence of cattle grazing, because we don't know if cattle are going to exhibit a preference for greener grass that might stay green a little longer, maybe grow a little better. So we've got to cage them out from some small areas to measure that. And we don't have a lot of data yet. We've only had 1 year of post-compost sampling, and we're looking to increase our sampling this year so that we get more robust data. But it's trending a little bit towards more production on the compost plots than on the controls. And then a couple other areas where we're sampling. Testing runoff, because we often hear concerns voiced about compost leaching from water moving through it and leaching out some of that, particularly on slopes. And so we wanted to address that concern. And we're measuring soil greenhouse gas fluxes. And this is really the work of Rebecca Riles in her lab at UC Merced. You can see, let me back up. Let me try to explain in a nutshell my real layman's understanding of soil greenhouse gas fluxes, which is that soils respirate, and that includes greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. The white chamber you see in the photo here is collecting those gases, and the tubing is circulating those gases down to an analyzer so that Becca and her team can analyze those flux emissions in real time. And what she found is that when the compost went on, she was measuring daily, and we have a baseline from before the compost went on. A couple weeks out, we slowed down on the frequency here, but initially there was a spike of increase in greenhouse gas flux emissions, but then things normalized, and we're really not seeing a whole lot of difference between the control and the compost.
Ian, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you. So next steps with the Healthy Soils Demonstration Project are to do things like this workshop. And like I've said a couple of times, this is the first in a series. We'll be doing at least 3 more over the next year or so. And within those workshops, we'll have some different focus areas. It won't always be the exact same discussion. We do want to get folks out to the site to see it. That's what this was intended to be almost a year ago. Obviously, we're doing a webinar because we have to right now. But we will get folks out to actually see firsthand how this looks. And we'll also be sharing much more of the data as that analysis continues, because we'll continue sampling. And so my office will continue to fill up with bags and bags of soil before we get them over to UC Merced for analysis. And so this Healthy Soils Demonstration Grant will run into 2022. And that's when we'll really be looking at some final results. Now, beyond the Healthy Soils Demonstration Grant, we have other things happening at the property. We're completing the Carbon Farm Plan. The RCD also has grant funding from the State Coastal Conservancy through a Climate Ready grant, and that's going to allow us to spread more compost on some other areas. We're really interested in trying out some different compost because the material we put on that you saw is a very woody compost, very high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So we want to get something that's a little more balanced. We want to do some riparian restoration. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of NRCS EQIP supported practices going on now and into the next couple of years: fencing, stockwater, and pond restoration. And so a quick nod to many various partners who are supporting different elements of this work, not just the Healthy Soils Demonstration Grant, but our Carbon Farm planning in general. And also a big thank you to our state grant funders, the Department of Water Resources, Department of Food and Agriculture, and the State Coastal Conservancy. And with that, I am going to turn this over to my colleague Stephanie, who's going to moderate some question and answer. And this is a time to ask questions to Jeffrey Creque, Joe Paulo, Kelly Schoonmaker, and myself.
Thanks, Ian. So the first question that we have coming in is from Stuart Weiss of Creekside Science. How did you come up with the 5% of California grasslands? I think that would be a good question for Jeff to answer.
Yeah, that's really a ballpark estimate based on accessibility of sites, slope conditions, special status species, special status soils, proximity to compost facilities. All of those parameters kind of go into that assessment.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. And then another question for you from Lawrence Ford. How important are California annual dominated rangelands, among other agricultural working lands? And what about the conflict of increasing productivity with biodiversity conservation?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, or anyone else on the panel.
Well, one thing I would say is that we have never proposed putting compost on grassland that was not grazed. And the reason for that, obviously, is to be able to use livestock as a tool in managing the vegetation response to that compost application. So, I think the work that the Alameda RCD is doing and the science that's ongoing around this work, both by Becca Riles and Wendy Silver and others, will be able to drill down into those questions with a little more specificity. But from my perspective, again, I think it's safe to assume, and there are some good published papers on this, Larry, as you know, that we have lost a certain amount of carbon from our rangeland soils in California over the last 200 years, and that restoring a small percentage of that is unlikely to result in dramatic shifts in species composition on those rangelands. And the data I've seen so far has supported that hypothesis, but I'm glad to see this work ongoing and expanding so that we can really answer that question comprehensively at some point.
Great. And then Susan Morin has a couple questions on compost, about the ingredients of compost, worms present, mycelium, and the depth of compost applied. I'm actually going to save those questions to be answered in the second half, if that's okay. And then Sophie Crystal has a question that relates to Lawrence Ford's question about just the impact on native species versus non-native species.
Again, I think ongoing research on this is important. Again, we have not advocated applying compost to intact native grassland systems. Of course, we might argue about what that means, but generally, I think we recognize that if you have a coastal prairie or other intact native grassland, why would you apply compost to that system? So I think our focus has been, at least on the Marine Carbon Project side and the Carbon Cycle Institute side, has been on more disturbed grassland systems, annual California grassland systems dominated by non-native species. And again, I think this ongoing work is really important in getting to a really solid answer to that question, which remains a very good question.
Yeah. All right, and then Stuart has a question about the cost difference between blowing and spreading, and I'm also going to table that question to be answered, Ian, unless you want to answer it right now.
We'll cover that in the second hour.
Okay, great. Marty Miesler has a question. With the greenhouse gas flux, what was the lack of difference between control and compost expected? What is the thinking process behind increases in flux? What processes?
That's a lot. I don't think I can answer that, and I certainly can't answer it well. Jeff, I don't know if you have anything you want to add there, but I would say
stab at it. I know Becca's with us, so maybe she'd want to step in. But the assumption, well, the question, I guess, around this is are there going to? I mean, since our goal here, our motivation, if you will, is to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere with this strategy, among other reasons, obviously. We don't want to see a spike in nitrous oxide or methane emissions, or even a significant spike in soil respiration of carbon dioxide associated with the application of compost to the rangeland system. If we end up emitting more greenhouse gases than we're sequestering through this process, we have not achieved our goals, obviously. And so I think it's gratifying to see those preliminary results and see, no, there was not a significant difference between those treated and untreated plots with respect to emissions, and that is supportive of the practice as a greenhouse gas mitigation strategy.
Thank you. Rachel from East Merced RCD asks, when will the livestock be able to interact with the composted land after application?
Immediately. The cattle were not excluded during this process, and you'll see some slides. They were pretty curious about the compost piles themselves.
Yeah. Derek Trowbridge asks a question for Ian. You said you were looking for more balance in your carbon and nitrogen ratio for compost. Can you explain what you were looking for further in that regard?
Yeah, we were, and Kelly might have to help me out here, but I think the compost that we took delivery of was very, very woody, and I'm struggling to remember the exact ratio. We wanted something that was a compost greater than an 11-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, but probably somewhere closer to more like 20-to-1 as opposed to what we actually had. Do you want to add to that, Kelly?
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about C to N ratio next, but I can tell you it was about, I want to say it was 28. And I think the spec we had said we moved it up to 25, thinking we were getting a green waste compost anyway. It might be on the higher end, but yeah. And then Jeff, you would, we could talk about, maybe if there's time at the end, we could talk about C to N ratio and what is an ideal C to N ratio for this application, because there's still a lot. We're always learning, like, what is the, we're learning about this process every time we do another application. So
cool. And then the next question is more about the C to N ratio. And so it's a hot topic and we'll continue to talk about that. Julie Gallagher asks, we would like to apply our goat manure and excess hay compost to our grazing land. Is that a possibility? And if so, how do we test the quality, like C to N ratio percentage or compost of the compost?
I can answer that. You can send it into a lab, and I'm going to show some data sheets of what you might get back from them during that time. But yeah, you can send it into a lab. Soil control lab in Watsonville is a good lab.
And I'll just add to that that in the fourth presentation today, when we talk with Calhoun Ranch, part of their process has been to send in soil samples to lab, not compost samples, but I think we might touch on some similarities there. As to whether that is a good material to put on, the shorter answer is I don't know, but Kelly is going to talk about some feedstocks and all about compost coming up after the Q&A. And so we can try to circle back to that. And I think this has already been said, but if we don't get to your question or if we don't get to a satisfying answer, we are happy to follow up over email, and we'll be recording all the questions, it's really handy to have these in the chat as we go.
Thanks, Ian. Eliza will also talk about compost sourcing in the next half, so sit tight. Amy Ritchie asks, initial results of experiments I have seen here and elsewhere have not shown the productivity and greenhouse gas benefits hoped for. Is that a fair characterization? And what would improve our results? Thicker compost?
Let me answer the first part of that first. The answer is we don't know yet. Again, we're only a little bit more than 1 year out from when the compost was put on. 1 year in itself doesn't give us a lot of seasonal variation, rainfall variation, any of those things to have a lot of data to make any real strong statements about. And so that's why we'll be continuing to sample well into 2022. So a little too soon to say. As to whether a thicker compost would have a greater impact, I think actually that's been an area of quite a bit of research, and Jeff, maybe you want to add to that, but it's my understanding that Becca Riles and others have found, including and Wendy Silver, have found that there was not a real significant difference over a long enough time scale between a heavier application of compost and a lighter application, meaning a 1/2 inch versus a 1/4 inch. Is that about right, Jeff?
Yeah, that's about right. The original Marine Carbon Project research used 1/2 inch, but then subsequently, as Rebecca was running model runs with various volumes or various quantities of compost, the 1/4 inch emerged as being just as effective. And subsequently, Dr. Silver's work has been utilizing a 1/4 inch application across multiple sites across the state. So it looks like that's an appropriate application rate.
Great. Thank you. Out of our time, or Stephanie.
Yeah, we are at our time, but I think that this last question is actually a really important question. And so I'd love to have Joe answer it if that's okay.
Sounds great.
Yeah,
it's mine.
It's but yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So Joe, what's in it for the rancher? Joe, are you there? Oh. Joe, you're muted if you're trying to answer. Hey, Allison, could you request to unmute him potentially?
I did.
Okay. Okay.
There.
Oh,
Can you hear
there
me?
you
There we
go.
go. Perfect.
Well, for the rancher, I believe, water retention is with the lack of rain that we're having and everything, and any way we can regulate the retention of the water, if any improvement that we can get would be along with your emissions. And there's one thing that I think everybody has to know that's given in questions is these aren't it isn't your grandfather's ranches anymore with the emission problem, with the greenhouse gases, with everything. I think the rancher has to be involved just as everybody, all of you are involved, all the information that we can get and all the input, it's gonna improve our grazing lands in the future. And I think now is the time to begin these processes. Maybe not so much as what it is doing for me at this minute, but what can we do in the future to improve it?
That's great. Thank you. And thank you for being here. We are going to start our next presentation. I also want to mention that we do have an evaluation that we will share. I will share the link after we start our next presentation, just in case anyone needs to jump off, but we will have time to fill it out at the end of the second hour. So if you are sticking around, don't worry about that now. You can fill that out at the end, but we would love your feedback. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly and Ian, and they're going to talk about compost for carbon farming and answer a lot of those questions people had.
Okay, you should all be able to see my screen. Yeah. All right. Okay. So, and you can all hear me? Looks good. Okay, great. So I'm going to provide an overview of compost, what it is, how it's made, and how to select it, and a couple of considerations that we used for this project. And then I'm going to hand it over to Ian. He's going to talk more about the specifics of getting the compost that we used for this project. Okay. So I find a good way to talk about what compost is first start with what it isn't. It isn't soil, and it's not fertilizer. And then kind of similarly, there's a lot of things that are not compost, but people confuse with compost because they're spread on the land, like manure and wood chips and biosolids. Kind of similarly, ag waste and food waste and green waste also get confused with compost. And none of these things are compost. However, the stuff on this slide is used to make compost. So it does have that in common, but on its own, it is not. It's what we call feedstock for compost. So what is compost? Compost, it's a product. It's a product of very managed aerobic decomposition, so in the presence of oxygen. And as you can see in this photo here, it shouldn't and doesn't, when it's finished compost, look like any of the feedstocks you saw in the previous slide. When it's mature, it shouldn't smell like ammonia or anything like that. It should smell like a forest floor. And the other thing, if it's mature, it should be, actually it should never smell like ammonia anyway, but it should smell like the forest floor when it's done. And when it's, and when you get it, it shouldn't be hot. And we'll talk a bit about like why it might be hot in a couple slides. So how you make it, you take a carbon-rich material or browns and greens or nitrogen-rich material, and then you supply that, mix it up, supply it with water and air. And it doesn't matter if you're doing it at the scale of 1 cubic yard or at one of the biggest composting facilities in the state. This is the basic recipe for compost. So after you mix those materials together, the microbes start to go to work on the easy to digest stuff like proteins and fats and cellulose, that kind of thing. And as they do that, they generate a lot of heat. And they generate so much heat that they raise the temperature enough that now new microbes are coming in that really like the heat, the thermophilic microbes. I'm going to talk a little bit about this stage because it's really important. These microorganisms work super fast. And sorry, can everyone hear me okay? All right, sorry. And so these microbes, in the thermophilic stage, move really, really fast. And so they're generating a lot of heat. And so this is great because what happens in this stage is the pathogenic bacteria and protozoa and weed seeds get killed off, which is good. Bringing any of those things to our either farms or ranches, right, or any other application. And it's so important that it's regulated. So when you buy a commercial compost from a permitted facility, part of that permit is they need to hold their compost at a certain temperature. It needs to be above 131 degrees and below 160 for consecutive days. So for example, I'll show you a photo of a windrow facility. They have to hold their temperature above 131 degrees for 15 consecutive days. So they know that the pathogens have been effectively removed. So after they digest all this easy to digest material, the temperature starts to drop and the thermophilic organisms start to decline, and you end back up, or you get back into that mesophilic kind of middle temperature range. And at this point, some of the decomposition of the harder to decompose things like lignin and wood starts to take place. And then this curing stage lasts for a while, and then you get into mature compost eventually. So here's what it's look like. Here's what it looks like on the ground. Here's a pile of feedstock. In this case, it's green waste. You can sort of see you've got some browns and some greens there. They pile it up, and as soon as they can, they grind it or shred it, and they put it into piles. You can see here is someone measuring the temperature, which is something they have to do every day just to make sure they're holding it at that in that thermophilic stage. And after it's made it through the composting process, it gets screened, and you end up with the what we call overs, bigger pieces. And this is mostly wood, right? Because wood takes a lot longer to decompose than do some of the other types of materials. So we call these overs, and ideally these get incorporated back into a pile to go through the process again, or they can get screened and they can get sold as a really, really effective mulch, especially for erosion control and slope stabilization. I'll show you a picture of what that looks like. And then, of course, you get compost. And this is, both of these are compost, but this is what we think of when we think of compost. This is a finer compost. It's like a 1/2 inch screen or less. And this is what we applied on the property. So Jeff talked about the benefits of compost. I'm going to just go over them again. It all comes from organic matter. When you have organic matter, you improve soil structure by creating aggregates. And the aggregates in the soil, because they're making little clumps, they create spaces between the clumps. And in those spaces act to improve water holding capacity. They're places for the water to be stored and air to be stored. They also improve drainage. The other thing compost does is it improves nitrogen or nutrient cycling with slower release nutrients. And all this leads to healthier, bigger plants that facilitate carbon sequestration in the soil. Here's some of the ways you can use compost. Of course, on the right, you've seen these photos a bunch. This is us, this one, not us, but this is the application on the property, but you can do it at a small scale too. Here it is, here's top dressing being done by hand at the farm at Wente. This is also Wente on the left. You can incorporate it deep into the soil with planting, just straight into the soil. So you use like a broad fork, so you're not really tilling the soil, or a ripper if you have a bigger property that if you want to get the soil deep down in the root zone. And then here's this erosion control application I was talking about. This is one of the reasons why we are not worried. We are excited to be a demonstration site for a research project of compost application on slopes on rangeland. There isn't a lot of data out there about the application of compost on rangeland, but there are a lot of examples of compost application on slopes in the construction industry. So this is a Caltrans construction project done several years ago. And on the right, they used what they call a compost blanket, which is that coarser compost. It's about an inch or two deep. And on top of it, they've got blown in straw. Well, on the left, you can see they've got just blown in straw. And so what was so great about this project is right after they installed everything, they had a rainstorm, and which I guess wasn't so great for them, but it did really make some good comparison photos. So you can see that the blown on straw has just been washed out, and there's a bunch of sediment at the bottom of the slope, but the compost blanket has held the slope in place, because what it does is it absorbs not only the impact of rain, but also the water itself. It reduces the overall amount of runoff and reduces the sedimentation and improves water quality. Anyway, so where do you get it? If you have the space and the material and the time, you can make it. And so this is the Wente Vineyard in Livermore. And even at the small scale, you can make it. We have a toolkit to get small farms started on on-farm composting. We also provide some technical assistance for that. But then sometimes, and most of the time, people can't make enough to satisfy their needs, right? And so there are several resources here. Composting Council has a nationwide map of composters. CalRecycle is where you can find a permitted facility, which I'll talk about, and in the state. And if you're local in the Bay Area and maybe you're a smaller operation, lawntogarden.org has composting composters as well as vendors that might sell in smaller amounts. Okay, so how do you know it's good, right? This is really important. So there's standards. I just mentioned permitting, right? So you want to make sure you get compost if you're buying it from a permitted facility. And what this means is that CalRecycle is regulating this facility. The local enforcement agency is going out there every month to make sure that everything's safe, their temperatures are being held at the right temperature, and that things are done cleanly while they're following all the rules they need to follow. In addition, there are other standards. So any of you that work in the organic farming industry already know CDFA is regulating the organic input materials you need to use. Compost would be one of them. There's also OMRI, the Organic Materials Review Institute, which is a voluntary program that also, and both of those standards differ to the National Organic Standard. They use the same thing. That's another standard you might look at. Now, and if you want to make sure your compost is tested consistently, you can look for a U.S. Composting Council seal of testing assurance participating composting facility. When you do that, when you get your testing data, so I want to make sure I address these testing data questions, but if not, I'll just answer them later. But when you get your testing data back, you're going to get a few sheets. You'll get a couple that look like this. This is from this is in the STA, the Seal of Testing Assurance format. So it's always in the same format. All the tests are conducted the same every single time, so you know what you're getting. It's easy to compare. You may also get an interpretation sheet, something like this, and maybe also a narrative. And then you'll get the supplemental data sheet. This is from Soil Control Lab, which is the lab that I had just said you could send your compost to and test it. And they're lovely people, and they'll answer your questions if you have them. So I would say I'm not going to go through all the different parameters for compost, because like I said, we are still learning a lot, but ultimately it depends on the application too. So a row crop, is going to want some maybe more readily available nitrogen than a rangeland application. So there's a lot of different things to consider when you're getting a compost. And we can certainly address specifics in the questions. One thing you do want to make sure you get is, well, let me back up. When you get these data sheets, you can never get the compost. The compost you use is never the stuff that was tested. It's just impossible because of time. And so what you can do to kind of get around that is look for consistency over time. And so ask for 6 data sheets instead, and that'll give you about a year or so, more or less, of data. And you can tell if there's you can see any outliers and pull them out and just kind of see how the compost is faring over the course of a year. Now, I know I said I wasn't going to talk about these different parameters, but one thing I do want to talk about are inerts or physical contaminants. So contaminants, not like toxic contaminants, but inerts, glass and plastic. And you're probably like, well, wait, what are those even doing in there? Well, I often think that too, but basically with the increase in curbside green waste and especially food waste collection, we end up these materials end up finding their way to the composting facility, mainly from just innocent mistakes or thinking that the composter can go ahead and just remove all the plastic bags, and they certainly do their best to remove as many as they can up front. But it's just, there's one plastic bag going through a grinder makes a lot of little bits of plastic. Let's just say that. And so this is something that is regulated by the state. And so there's a maximum amount of physical contaminants you can have, which is 0.5% by weight of glass and plastic and other contaminants. film plastic specifically can only be 0.1%, but that's still a lot of film plastic because it's really light. So you can definitely see this. You can sort of see if you can see this right here, but it is something that is recorded on your data sheet. So let's see. And so okay, you get your data sheets, you're happy with it. Now, if you can, getting a sample is great, but even better is visiting the composting facility, because you get to see how the place is run. You can smell it. You can see Ian and I visited on election day, and you get to ask the composter anything you want and just get a sense of how it's produced. And you can pull your sample there. And also, it's just really fun. So I recommend everyone do that. And then last step, when the compost arrives on site, check it before it gets dumped, okay? That is really important, because it's no fun to put a load that you don't want back into a truck, and nearly impossible. And it rarely has to happen. And I've never had it happen. However, it's just better to check up front than wait till it's on the ground like this. Now, someone asked if the cows had access to the grazing, and as you can see, they did. This was the thing we were actually kind of worried about, that they would go turn the pile and spread it all out themselves without us doing it. But they were pretty well behaved. So for our project, the things that we wanted to focus on, of all the different things you could look at in a compost, were certainly minimizing contamination, and partially because of the cows. You can see how curious they are. Not just when it's in the pile, but if they were going to eat the grass, or they will eat the grass, and if there's glass there, then they will eat that too, and we do not want that to happen. And the other issue is you're only applying 1/4 inch. I know that was a question someone asked. You're only applying 1/4 inch. So that goes a long way. So that's just like spreading. If you had a contaminated compost, that would be spreading it all over the place. So we really want to minimize the inroads. And then the other thing we wanted to do was make sure that the amount of available nitrogen was sort of matching the release was matching the plant's needs. And so we deferred to some research. There isn't a lot done about that with different types of compost, but the research that we did see done pointed to green waste compost having a good balance of nitrogen release to the native plant uptake in nitrogen. And then of course distance, because we want to minimize our greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think with that, that's all I have got. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ian, and he's going to tell you more about our compost choosing process.
Okay, thanks. Everyone hearing me okay with this switch over here? I think so. Okay, great. So part of the Alameda County RCD's process to really look at compost projects and think about, does this make sense? Has been to think about the feasibility of sourcing the compost. What's it cost? Where's it going to come from? Is it good quality? And so we conducted a survey of compost facilities at the very beginning of 2019. So 2 years ago. This information is a touch out of date, but I think still relevant. We contacted facilities that were within about 70 miles of Sunol in Alameda County, just as a central location for us to base these cold calls on. We wanted facilities that met the standards that Kelly just described. And so I think we reached out to at least 15, maybe a little more, and we heard back from many, but not all. And you can see the various distances from Sunol. We asked about some hypothetical costs. And again, delivery, assume it would go to Sunol, assume we want to buy 680 cubic yards, that's around 300 or so tons of compost. And we got a variety of information back. Everything from as low as $4.50 per yard of compost up to $18, $20 per yard. And that's a big range. Some of that is based on quality, but some of it's also based on how compost facilities, what their business model is. And that's a lot to get into. So that's a big factor, is, a lot of variation in the cost per yard, but also in the delivery fees. The freight of trucking the compost can add up quickly. And so you can see, sorry, let me get the a pointer here. You can see the delivery fees were as low as $4,900 and as high as $12,000. And so total costs for this hypothetical project were anywhere from 8,200 up to 25, almost 26,000. So we didn't stop there. We also contacted some spreading services and asked them for a hypothetical quote, which is tough because we didn't give them any actual real site factors to consider. You know, this was a, just assume there's good access, but it's going to be here in Sunol, and we want you to spread 680 cubic yards of compost over 20 acres. And that spreads out to a 1/4 inch application. And so we got three estimates from mechanical spreading operations. That means a tractor pulling a compost spreader. And there was even a range here, you know, $4 a yard for a total of $2,700 up to $8,000 for the whole job. And we also talked to 2 blown-on compost services, so Applied Landscape Materials and Jet Mulch, and they were pretty similar. So cost per acre, about $1,100 or $1,200. Cost per yard, you can see $35 or so. And so total cost for them quite similar, but triple to quadruple the cost of mechanical spreading. So now let's look at 2 real projects. One we've already heard about, which is our Healthy Soils Demonstration Grant work at StopWaste. And the second one we're going to hear about next, which is Calhoun Ranch. And here we have real costs, real information, because we've done these projects. Both were implemented in December 2019. Both used compost from Vision Recycling in Livermore. And the big difference here is not just the quantity of compost, but the difference in the spreading methods. So let's start with the blue table at the top. You can see we wanted different volumes of compost. The price was the same per yard. So we have different costs based on the volume. Delivery costs were very similar. StopWaste is only 4.5 miles from Vision. Calhoun Ranch, 14 miles, but fewer truckloads. So pretty similar freight costs. And here you can see the total cost for each of those projects. Now in the green table, we're looking at the cost for spreading that compost. And here's where things really deviate. We had to use jet mulch because of the soil conditions due to rain, as I said earlier, for StopWaste. They spread compost over 12.5 acres at a cost of about $45 per yard, plus an extra equipment fee, which I'll show you in the next slide. Total there was $20,000 just to spread the material, compared to mechanical spreading at Calhoun Ranch for a little over $2,500. And that was for half the acreage. So if you want, we can double that. It's really a big difference in time and labor. When Jet Mulch did the job at StopWaste, they spent about 3 days with 2 to 3 crews of 2 to 3 guys per crew. So that's 2 or 3 blower trucks fully staffed for 3 days to do that work. Very labor intensive, lots of equipment. By comparison, the mechanical spreading that Paul Santucci did for Calhoun Ranch, it took about half a day plus their mobilization of equipment, and that was a 2-person crew. So that's just where some of this difference comes from. And here you can see the difference in total costs between the 2 projects for those direct costs. And so last thoughts before I move on and give other people a chance to speak here. Freight, we talked about distance. Also, truck size makes a difference. You can see in the video here, a full tractor trailer with a walking floor delivering compost at StopWaste. And that's only because the roads were good enough for trucks this size to make it up there. So the site access is going to make a difference to what sort of trucks you can use and how many loads you're going to need hauled. Contingency, we ordered a little too much compost. We were concerned that we would lose a lot of material through transfers. We ordered more than we really needed to. Good lesson learned there. And then finally, equipment bottlenecks. You can see this high lift yellow loader. This was the extra cost that we had to absorb from Jet Mulch because they needed this specialized lift to keep their blower trucks loaded from the compost piles on site. And so with that, I am going to close out. Boy, where did everyone go? There you are. Close out that presentation and help introduce the next one. So bear with me while I pull up another set of slides here. I'm really excited to introduce my colleague, Jackie Charbonneau, in just a minute, and she's going to be talking with Calhoun Ranch. But first, let me give a quick summary of information. If only I could find the share button again. There we go. All right, and hopefully you are all still with me. So Calhoun Ranch, Jackie's going to tell you all about. And what I want to just say very quickly is to touch on the actual compost spreading they did in 2019, because it's a lot of information for anyone to try to verbalize without some sort of illustration. So let me just point to this map. Here's
Ian,
part of the property. Yep.
really quickly, we see a presenter view that's maybe not the view you intended. It's not a big deal. Looks great.
Let's try again. Okay, how's that look?
Perfect.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. So we can see on the map here, we've got some different shapes outlined here in green and pink. And so this big green arrow is pointing to about a 2-acre area that got a one-time application of compost. It was a 1/4 inch application, and the RCD supported that with funding from our Department of Water Resources grant. Now on the right, you can see 2 big pink arrows pointing to different areas. One's 2 acres, one's 1 acre, so a total of 3 acres. Those received a much lighter application of compost, only 1/10 of an inch, which is pretty hard to accurately get to come out of a compost spreader. But that is what CDFA's Healthy Soils Incentives Program requires. They require that light application for 3 consecutive years. We use the exact same compost. It was put on by the same spreader on the same day as I just talked about a few minutes ago. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jackie Charbonneau, ecologist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and her discussion with 3 Calhoun sisters.
Thanks, Ian. Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie. I'm the ecologist in the Livermore office for the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I know a lot of you. I've been in the office for a while now. It's going on 18 years. So, you know, I always like to say I started when I was like 12 or something along those lines. I have had the privilege of working with the Calhoun sisters for quite some time now. And I think I met Nancy first at a workshop perhaps. And I told them recently that these three sisters are the type, they're the folks that make my job kind of dreamy, like working with landowners like this. So I'm lucky to be able to work with them, and I'm excited to have this conversation today. And so I'd like to introduce you to Nancy, Mary, and Susie. And I don't know how this really works, if they have to say something for speaker view to come on here or what.
No, they're all pinned, so you're good.
Okay, great. So hi, ladies. Nice to see you.
Hello, Jackie. Good to see you.
My favorite part of the job that I do is working with ranchers and landowners and kind of the human element. And I've been fortunate, like I said, to work with the 3 of you and got to know your dad a bit too before he passed. And I've loved to hear the stories of you all growing up on the ranch. And I was hoping you guys could tell us a little bit of the history of the Calhoun Ranch and kind of what has inspired you to do such great natural resources related projects. I'm not sure who's going to start. Maybe I think Nancy. Okay. All right.
Talkative one. So for us, 3 of our great grandfathers were actually farmers and ranchers that settled in the Livermore Valley in the 1800s. And our grandfather and our mother both grew up on the home farm on Stanley Boulevard in Livermore. And our grandfather purchased the first ranch up here in the 20s with his brother, and our mom spent her summers up here with her siblings. And our grandfather ran a cow-calf operation. And growing up, we were his cowboys on the ranch, and we pretty much roamed the hills every weekend, all of us and our cousins. Our mother and her siblings grew up on the farm, so they kind of got burnt out with the chores, and they all chose off-farm jobs after leaving the farm, and so did our generation. So for quite a while, it was our grandfather running with our help. One of our cousins, Dave, that's here today, he actually stayed in the business and went cowboying in Montana. And then once our grandfather retired, our dad and our uncles took over. And so this picture here, it's actually a picture of the farm. If you can go back, it's a picture of the farm our mom and grandfather grew up on. And our mom painted it. And so one thing real quick, okay, you can't probably tell it, but the water tower, her little brothers are throwing her duck off of the water tower with a parachute. And unfortunately, it didn't survive, and it probably what helped her to become an animal lover and somewhat of an animal activist was her brothers. But here on the Calhoun Ranch, our parents purchased this next to the home ranch in the 50s, and our parents kept it in a really natural state. They had Paul Marcial do a road from the top to the bottom, about the only work that's been done. And then we, my husband and I built the house here and live here, and our parents built a ag building better known as the Calhoun Party Barn that's here, which some of you have seen. And then some of the inspiration, our father and grandfather, he only had 3 girls, so he was stuck with us. And he would take us hunting and fishing. And this helped us to really get out into nature, out into the habitats, and really gain an appreciation for the outdoors. And our mother, being raised on the farm, she was a little different than the rest of the family. She loved to read. And in between chores, she'd be reading. And then as we were growing up, as we'd be driving around, our mother would shout out, "Hey, there's a wildflower, pull over." And so we'd have to pull over for wildflowers and pull over for museums, and we'd all just be groaning, "Come on, Mom." And she often took us to Pacific Grove to see the monarchs. And she visited often, loved it at the beach and down there. And so this picture is another painting of her mother's, which she used to bring a wide variety of friends. She was a resource librarian, a historian, and an art teacher. And so she'd bring all these friends out for wildflower walks. And so this is a picture of one of those wildflower walks. And probably through osmosis over the years, we all learned the names of the wildflowers on our ranch from her. And so again, that's kind of where some of our appreciation came in.
I've never seen this painting before. It's beautiful.
We found it cleaning out their house.
Oh, okay.
I hadn't seen it either.
Wow.
And so I thought it was perfect for the presentation. And then something else that's really been an inspiration for us is a couple of the ranching families that have taken on conservation to save their property. And one of those families are the Koopmans. And Melinda actually grew up in our neighborhood, and Tim and Melinda were in Young Farmers and Ranchers with us, and we all worked at the Alameda County Fair together. And Mary was a roommate of Gail and helped with the walnut harvest when Herman was still alive on the Koopman farm. And Tim's fight to save the family ranch through conservation was through those conservation easements. That's something that we've watched closely because we certainly save the family. We don't want to lose the property. And then another friend, our dad was a longtime friend of Robin Rich Fletcher's. They fished up at Lake Almanor for years together. And the Fletchers created a conservation mitigation bank on their ranches here in Livermore. And so our dad was a little reticent about conservation and a little concerned about some of the things we were talking about. So I had invited Rob over to discuss with him the benefits of a conservation easement along with the pros and cons of the conservation process. And so it really helped to have these examples for us to look to and a path to follow. And so in 2018, our dad agreed to a conservation plan that NRCS and Point Blue developed for us, helped us develop. And I think one thing that Joe said is that this isn't business as usual. It's not our grandfather's farm anymore. And if we're not willing to change with the times, I mean, we could literally be left in the dust. And so you've got to take risks. You've got to learn. You got to make changes. And so our passion for the outdoors, for natural resources and conservation came from both our parents and our grandparents, and for them, probably from our great grandparents.
I love the stories of your parents, and I love how your mom was just like this, you know, kind of secret environmentalist, and your dad would just, he went along for the ride, and you know, I think he secretly liked a lot of it too, right?
Yes.
So you kind of alluded to your conservation plan, and you guys have developed a carbon farm plan with NRCS and the RCD and Point Blue. How did you become interested? I know the answer to this, but how did you become interested in carbon farming, and sort of how does it fit into your goals?
Well, so the three of us went down to Solvang for the California Women for Ag convention, and we're Danish, so it was really fun. And so at that convention, the Santa Barbara RCD presented their Healthy Soils project, and it showed a landscape on the Chamberlain Ranch, and it was a carbon farming test site, and it looked like ours. It was rangeland, hills. You know, I never thought we could put compost up here, and it showed the before and after where there was an obvious increase in feed. And so this is where we learned about the grants from the CDFA. And so on our drive home, we emailed you guys, we emailed the RCD and the NRCS asking about the program because we were definitely interested. And then we've all attended the California Rangeland this is a long one, California Rangeland Conservation Coalition's Summit for the past 2 years. And carbon farming has been a hot topic for the past 2 years. And so with a couple of years of drought under our belt and learning that carbon farming can improve the moisture retention in the soil and increase the grazing capacity, this helped us to think, you know, this is kind of a no-brainer to give this a try. And so part of our conservation plan is to work to increase the native species and eliminate invasive species. And Ling helped us to discover, unfortunately, that we had Medusa head on the ranch, and we had never seen it. And I probably wouldn't have known what it was. And so part of this conservation effort is to get rid of the stinking Italian thistle and the stinkwort and the star thistle. So that's all part of the conservation plan. And then through succession planning, that's kind of how my interest got started, because I could see that down the line, splitting up the ranch with family members was going to take some work. And so I started attending workshops. And we want to be able to pass it on to the next generation for our kids, and that it be sustainable both environmentally and economically. And fortunately for us, our parents were very frugal and left us in a very good place to be able to maintain the ranch and make improvements. And so our main goal is to reserve the property in as much of a natural state as we can and incorporate best practices for conservation and keep it viable for rangeland for cattle.
love that. I was thinking, so I was able to be out on the property when you guys, I wasn't able to be out in StopWaste when the compost was spread, but I was fortunate I was able to be out on your guys' place. Can you talk a little bit about, since we heard the StopWaste, what happened there? Can you talk about how it was applied on the Calhoun Ranch and some of the logistical challenges?
Sure. So first, we don't have a tractor. So it's like, how the heck are we going to spread this stuff? Right. So my sister Mary started researching rentals. I reached out to neighbors and other farmers, and we found an old family friend, Paul Santucci, who lives right down the road, would be the best match for our project. And he had everything we needed. He had the loader shown there. He had the tractor and the compost spreader. And so it was
and Doug to help.
Yes.
And so before we got started, I had spoken with a local farmer. I'd spoken with Dan Marciel about spreading compost, and he and his dad had tried it a number of years prior. And he said the compost that they got was so full of what I just learned today are contaminants. It was full of plastic and trash. And he said they tried it for a few years and it just didn't work. And so fortunately for us, with Vision Recycling and that certified level of compost, that stuff was amazing. It was, like she said, it smelled like a forest floor. So that problem had definitely been rectified over the years. And as mentioned earlier, the delivery can be a huge expense. And fortunately, Vision Recycling was close by. And the first year it was a little hectic because it had rained, like Ian said, just terribly. There's mud everywhere. And one of the trucks kind of got for a while. So we got it all done. We did have to, and Ian mentioned this too, that we had to rush to get it done by the end of the year. So, you know, we just had this small window to beat the deadline. And that first year, we also broadcast some native grass seed. And so that was part of the CDFA HSP incentive. So we're waiting to see how that goes. And so this process will repeat. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
Okay. So we'll be doing this for 3 years. We just finished the second round. Each year we have to take soil samples and send it for analysis. And I have to thank Stephanie for that, because she came out and helped drill by hand, all the holes for the soil samples. And it never fails. It's always hot and it's always dry, and it's a lot of work. So thanks to Stephanie.
103. Yeah, Stephanie's amazing.
Yeah. And then last month there was a little hitch in the giddy up when I got an email that said that we hadn't performed all that was required for reimbursement. And I'm just like going, oh my God, my stomach dropped, because I'm always in trouble for forgetting to do something because I'm the little sister. But fortunately it wasn't my fault. It was they had a change of staff and they overlooked our paperwork. So whew, we made it. And so the second year of application in December was a breeze. We had all our ducks in a row. Second time, no problems. Now we just have to send in the next round of paperwork. And Ian always helps us with that, because I'm not good at crunching numbers and coming up with the little charts that we need. So Ian always provides us the charts for our reports. And
yeah.
So
Ian's good. He helps me with charts too. I'm not good at that either. So,
so 2 years under our belts, we're doing good.
Have you noticed that? Have you observed any changes? Have you noticed anything in the areas where the compost is spread?
Yeah, at this time we've got 2 years of serious drought conditions, and we haven't seen a difference yet. And so normally it's going to take years to see a marked change. And so we're waiting to also see, this is where we planted the native seeds. And so we're waiting to see if there will be a marked difference there. So we really need some rain for crying out loud.
Kind of removing the thatch in there too.
Yeah, definitely.
A lot of work.
Yeah.
So that's the California Conservation Corps out there helping, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. So I think we're running a little bit short on time, and our next topic is to chat about other projects happening on the ranch, and those are so vast. So I'm thinking maybe we limit it to your favorite project that has happened, your second favorite besides compost application and carbon farm planning. I know, yeah, I mean, I could speak to, we've done some livestock water distribution, which has been great, but I think that kind of the fun one is.
So the pollinator?
Yeah.
And it just so happened that Jackie, you were up here on a visit one day, and we were driving down to the ponds, and you spotted a milkweed plant. And we didn't even know we had milkweed on the property. Our mother showed us all the plants, but we never saw the milkweed. So we pulled over and checked out the milkweed and found it all up and down the small creek beds. And then the next year you spotted the first monarch on the milkweed.
Yeah, we found caterpillars, and I think a butterfly was flying around as well. It was really cool. That was a good day.
Yeah, and so now we're involved in a pollinator and milkweed project. And last year we planted 200 showy milkweed rhizomes, about 1,400 narrow leaf milkweed and pollinator attracting plugs in 3 different areas on the ranch. With the drought conditions, we actually tried to water once a month throughout the summer, and it's pretty brutal. Between the hottest August on record and the smoke and heat from the SCU complex fires, we weren't carrying buckets out in the field for the rest of the project. So now we're kind of ending up, we're finishing the plantings this month with California milkweed. We're planting, we planted 12 plants. Here at the house, we have a plot that's irrigated and fenced. And the last time Rika was out, we let her know that we have a gopher that's the level of Caddyshack in our pollinator garden. And so she recommended we get an owl box. So we met with our the owl whisperer Irv, and he informed us about it. So hopefully we'll get the owl box up to get the stinking gopher out of there. So we've been busy with all of your guys' help. We couldn't have done it without all of the NRCS and the RCD crew and the funding that you help us to get. We couldn't do it without you guys.
Well, thanks. It's really been our pleasure. It's been great. So Mary and Susie, do you want to add anything? I think there's lots of questions, and we're short on time, but if there's anything that you guys, I want to make sure that you have an opportunity.
I think she summed it up.
Yeah.
Nancy's good at that.
We gave her the material. She just had to spew it.
Yeah. All right. Well, it truly has been a pleasure to work with the 3 of you, and I look forward
Likewise.
to our next endeavors and seeing the place become keep doing what you're doing. Questions, I think.
Stephanie's going to take over, and we have a lot of questions, it looks like. That's great.
Great. Thanks for thanks for just being interactive. The questions are great. So Frank, it looks like we covered, the rate of compost being spread, 17 tons an acre, but could someone answer the question about how you adjust that to the speed of the tractor to make sure you have the right amount of compost spread?
We leave that to Paul Santucci, the engineer. I don't.
Not exact. He told me this round. He's going, when you're using a compost spreader, you've got the quantity, you've got the acreage, and you're trying to spread it evenly, and you just do the best you can.
Yeah, and if I may just add, from what I actually remember doing, there was a test area that we actually just put down a mat, and then he drove over it, spread the compost on top of it, and then took a ruler to see how thick the compost actually was. So you can test it essentially. and measure it. Alrighty, so moving on to the next question. Susan Morin asks, have you experienced seeing the California dung beetle?
I don't know.
Yeah,
Yes.
I saw it when I attended the UCCE Grazing Academy, but that was up in Northern California.
and we probably should check.
Yeah, we're always looking for butterflies. I guess we should start looking for dung beetles.
We'll have to flip some dung to
Yeah.
look for them.
Thanks. And then Amy asked, this is a great question for you, Kelly. How are large quantities of compost sourced, and is there a concern of compost contamination, like antibiotics from conventional livestock or other things?
Funny, I just texted you about this question. I think Ian did a great job of talking about how you would source it and reaching out to a bunch of facilities. I think this question may have come in, maybe not. But large quantities, typically you can go through a composting facility directly, or you can work with a compost broker. There are several compost brokers in the state, and then they work directly with the facility, and they can give you compost. And of course, you want to do all the same things that I talked about. Look at your testing data, go get a sample if you can, go to the facility if you can. As for the antibiotics issue, I mean, well, of course, it's not going to be an issue in a food waste compost, a green waste compost. But most of the PFRP, which is that thermophilic stage, the really hot time, which is the process to further reduce pathogens, has been shown to reduce the antibiotics and also ibuprofen and some other things. However, when you think about it, so StopWaste gave a grant several years ago to a researcher to study the removal of antibiotics in the thermophilic phase of composting. It was limited to the thermophilic phase, and unfortunately, that's a bacterially dominated phase. And antibiotics are what? They're for killing bacteria. So it was sort of like a war, I imagine, in that pile. It would be nice to see that work continued into mesophilic stages where you get different other types of microorganisms. But if antibiotics are a concern, you could certainly adjust that by looking at what your compost is made out of, and if you don't get a manure, dairy manure or antibiotics. However, I've never heard of anyone having a problem with it or any soil tests afterwards showing any damage to the soil bacteria.
Thanks, Ellie. And then another question about compost from Alexis Wilkman. Everyone has mentioned the issue of plastics and inert contamination in green waste compost. And they have had the same issue while looking for compost sources. They're wondering, is there a reason that these projects have used green waste compost as opposed to dairy manure compost? And what are the pros and cons to using dairy manure compost if you have experience using it?
Okay. Yes. I want to clarify first, green waste compost is actually one of the least contaminated feedstocks because it's the food waste that's really carrying it. And a lot of the green waste compost, like the Vision recycling compost we used, is self-haul, which means a landscaper is driving straight there, and they have a lot of control over rejecting loads and that kind of thing. So it can be a very clean stream. That being said, you can once it's curbside, there's a lot of different factors. For example, is it in a bin? Can people hide things in there? Or is it a big pile in the street that gets picked up? Those tend to be cleaner. So, there's a lot of different factors, but I would say green waste is still one of the cleanest ones. Food waste compost, which we totally think you should do. And I think food waste composting is an excellent thing. And food waste compost is a good compost. We just need to work on people getting the plastics and glass out of it. But to your question about dairy manure compost, it's going to be a higher nitrogen compost. You're still going to have greens and browns. You'll probably have some ag waste in there. There's no problem with it at all. We use both. The reason we went for green waste was really just because it was closest, not contaminated, and because it had a lower plant available nitrogen in it than does a dairy compost will. But it depends on the application, right? And we're still learning more and more. So for example, the compost that was used at the Marin Carbon Project and also throughout the state for the NRCS field trials, that was all dairy manure compost. And I think it had, at least the Marin Carbon Project, I think the C to N ratio was 11. And it was great. So I know there's some concern about having more nitrogen, maybe pushing, changing the species composition, but as Jeff said, we're still learning a lot about it every time we do a project.
Great, thanks, Kelly.
Was that even an answer? Sorry.
Eliza Noble has a comment and question for the sisters. Love all your great work, Calhoun sisters. They've noted that milkweed can be toxic to livestock. Are you excluding cattle from the areas you plant milkweed? Oh, Nancy, you're muted. And yeah.
Whoops. We've had milkweed on the property all through, I mean, probably for centuries. And there's really no proof that cattle have actually died from milkweed. And so we don't exclude it from them. It's been growing here for years.
But we do have one fenced in area that that we do grow the milkweed and the attractors so that it doesn't all get eaten by the deer and the cattle.
Yeah, great. Sophie, Crystal would like to hear a little bit about pathogen control. Does the certification for contamination also check for that, Kelly?
The certification for contamination. So yes, if you look on your data sheets, the compost has to pass for pathogens, and they measure two pathogens. They measure E. coli and they measure salmonella. And the reason they measure those two and why they don't, I know there's more pathogens than that, but the reason they measure those two is those two are very common and they're really, really hard to kill. And so if you can kill them, they're a good indicator that there's no other pathogens there. So there's an EPA standard for that, that the composting standard is referred to, and it has to pass that standard. Yeah. And so you would just look at it on the data sheet, and it's something that you can say you want in the compost, and they hope that answered your question.
Great. I think we should wrap up questions. We're running a couple minutes behind. If anyone needs to go ahead and jump off, you may do so, but please continue to join us if you can. And I did post the evaluation again in the chat, so please take a few minutes before you end with us and fill that out as well. Do we want to do one more question or move into Stephanie's? Ian, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. We wanted to take the last couple minutes here to first thank you all. Don't go yet, there's more. But thanks so much for coming out today. Like Allison has said, we'd love to get your feedback on this webinar. So please do help us out by taking our post-workshop evaluation. Before we go, Stephanie was gonna take just about 4 minutes to describe in a little more detail what CDFA's Healthy Soils Incentive Program is for folks who are a little bit less familiar with that. And so I'm gonna go ahead and get those just about 4 slides up. And Stephanie's going to share a little bit with you.
Great, thanks so much, Ian. So yeah, like Ian said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Healthy Soils Incentives Program. And the reason why I want to talk about it is because the hope is that this can serve as a helpful tool to implement some of the practices that you've heard about today, like compost application. So we'll just talk a little bit about what the program is, funded practices, eligibility, application process, and then how you can get help with this process. So the Healthy Soils Incentives Program is a program offered through the CDFA. And essentially, this is just financial assistance in the form of grants to help implement practices that, 1, improve soil health, 2, capture carbon in the soil, and 3, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the CDFA has a whole list of practices that are eligible for this funding, and it covers a wide variety of production systems like croplands, orchards, vineyards, and grazing land. And so here I've just listed a couple practices like compost application, civil pasture, riparian forest buffer, but you can go online and find a full comprehensive list of all of those practices. And in order to be eligible for this funding, you must be either a California farmer, rancher, or a member of a Native American Indian tribe recognized by the government. You must own or lease land in California, and this land needs to be eligible based on NRCS standards. Their definition of an agricultural operation includes row, vineyard, field, and tree crops, commercial nurseries, nursery stock production, livestock, and livestock product operations. And lastly, these practices must be new practices that haven't been implemented before, and it must have greenhouse gas benefits, which can be calculated through a tool through the CDFA. And this is just a preview of what the application process looks like. It requires a project design, detailed design of the work plan, budget, mapping, and more. And I just want to note here that this is a pretty extensive and detailed process, and so this is a really great opportunity for you to utilize free services from technical assistance providers like resource conservation districts, UC Co-op Extension, or other similar organizations. And so I know you all are super excited to start applying for funding, but I should mention that the CDFA hasn't opened their funding cycle yet. But that's not to say that you can't get started with thinking about the practices you want to implement, check the program requirements, and start gathering all of the detailed information that you'll need for the application. And it's also never a bad time to reach out to your local RCD or extension office for more information. And you can find all of this information about their program and about providers on their website. And that's it. So I'll pass it back to Ian.
Great, thanks for that, Stephanie. And if folks have any questions about the Healthy Soils program, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're here to take questions about that program and try to help you. One thing we forgot to do a few minutes ago was give a big round of applause to Nancy, Mary, and Susie, and Jackie for helping with that conversation. We really, really appreciate all of you who've participated being here today. Truly thankful for all of our partners and speakers today, especially our carbon farmers and ranchers who've come out today and been part of this. And I can't say thank you enough, and I forget everything else I was going to say at this point. And so Allison, Stephanie, if there's anything I've left out and you want to jump in, this would be the time. Otherwise, we're going to wish you all a good evening.
We have covered it all.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks again.